channel. Today we are talking about those must-have ingredients that you should have in your kitchen for gluten-free baking. I'm not talking about butter or eggs or sugar or generic baking stuff like that. I'm talking about specific ingredients that are really going to help improve baking gluten-free foods. Alright, let's crack into it. My first ingredient today is a bit of an obvious one if you're used to gluten-free baking, and that is xanthan gum. Xanthan gum, contrary to popular belief, is not a chemical. It's actually a substance made out of fermenting sugars with a bacteria and is absolutely perfectly safe to use in gluten-free baking. I do see often online people talking about how they have reactions to binders like xanthan gum and Psyllium Husk, and that absolutely might be true, but as the current science stands, this is perfectly safe in the quantities that we use it. For gluten-free baking, you would have to have a whole lot more for it to start messing with your stomach. Unless, of course, you've got like a specific intolerance to this, then you know, you do you. So this is what xanthan gum looks like. It's very powdery, very fine substance, and it kind of acts like a substitute to gluten. If you add a little bit of water to it or any sort of liquid, it becomes gluggy, it becomes sticky. It starts to give that sort of glutinous texture that you would find in gluten foods like bread and cookies. However, the good thing about xanthan gum, unlike gluten, it can't be overworked, so you're okay if you overmix with this stuff. It should be absolutely fine. A reminder, some flour mixtures already have xanthan gum in it, so if you are looking to add extra, or if you're using a recipe that has xanthan gum on it, just be aware that you're not putting too much in. You might require a little bit extra, but generally if the flour mixture has it already, you probably don't for most things. My next ingredient is one that I've been using quite a lot of recently, and that is ground almonds or almond flour. The reason I'm showing you ground almonds today is that's all I've got in my cupboard, but I do prefer to use almond flour when I can find it. So I'm going to show you ground almonds today. As you can see, ground almonds are generally more coarser than normal flours, most flours actually, so I do tend to prefer to use almond flour itself, which is the very fine almond powder. But in saying that, both of them get the job done. The reason why I like to use almond flour is it has a high fat content, which is amazing at keeping bakes fluffy and moist for several days after they're already made. I've been testing this myself on blueberry muffins at the moment. My usual blueberry muffin recipe didn't have almond flour in it, and they were okay for 1 or 2 days. The blueberry muffins I made with just a little bit of almond flour in it are still going strong after 4 days. Let me show you. Here's one. Still 4 days old, so it doesn't look its best, but if I opened it up for you, it's still super moist and fluffy and delicious. So yeah, I love it. Just be aware, if you're using ground almonds, the almond texture itself doesn't tend to break down, so you will still feel that coarse texture. It's not necessarily a bad thing, just something to be aware of, and that's why maybe you'd go for almond flour instead. Next up we have tapioca flour. I love tapioca flour. Tapioca flour was the first flour that I used that really changed my baking, if that makes sense. There are things that you can make just with tapioca flour, like boba or tapioca pearls and pão de queijo, I think is how you say it, the Brazilian cheese balls, but mostly I use it with other flours or other flour blends. As you can see, tapioca flour is another really fine flour. Tapioca flour is very starchy. It has sort of a low absorption rate, but I've kind of found that the absorption rate increases after time. So say you add a little bit of tapioca flour to a little bit of water. At the start, it's not really absorbing at all. After a while, it will start to absorb, start to become more congealed. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just something to be aware of when you're baking with it. I find that tapioca flour is great for giving things structure. It's another tool that I use to sort of replicate gluten, if you will. I generally use it in my dumpling wrapper recipe. It's absolutely essential for my dumpling wrapper recipe, and also when I'm making just general flatbreads with a couple of different types of flour and some yogurt. As you can see, if you mix it with a lot of water, it's kind of got sort of a corn flour, cornstarchy vibe going on. But if you add in some more tapioca flour, probably not that much tapioca flour past Morgan, but a little bit more, you can see that the texture rapidly changes as I'm mixing in more tapioca flour. It becomes kind of like that clay stuff, that sand clay stuff where it forms it forms a structure, but as you cut into it, it sort of melts away. Do you know the stuff I'm talking about? As you can see, I'm picking it up. It's quite hard to hold, but as you squeeze it, it sort of becomes a liquid again. Honestly, it's magical stuff, but it is very useful. The next ingredient that I want to talk about is one I harp on about a lot. Sweet rice flour or glutinous rice flour, same thing. Absolutely love this stuff. Very important to note, there are different types of rice flour. This is not the same as white rice flour. It's definitely not the same as brown rice flour. It's specifically sweet rice flour. It's made in a slightly different way with slightly different grains of rice. It's actually the same type of rice that you'd make mochi out of. And if you've seen mochi before, eaten mochi before, it has that beautiful chew. It's sticky, it's gluggy. I don't know, I wanted to do a positive word, but I don't think gluggy is the right one. So having a little bit of a look here, once again, it's very fine. If you are pouring this into a bowl, pour it in nice and close, otherwise you'll get a poof of sweet rice flour, and the stuff can be a little bit tricky to get and you don't want to be wasting it. As you can see here, just mixing it with a little bit of water, it starts to become a little bit gluggy. I haven't actually done the best job of showing it here, but in terms of the recipes I like to use it for, I don't use it for everything, absolutely not. It would be a bit odd in some things, but I do like to use it for donuts. It sort of changes the texture from perhaps crumbly and fluffy to a little bit more still light. It's still an incredibly light flour, but it's more chewy. So I like to use it in donuts because if I don't use it, I find them too cakey. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. For me, I just find that they have a little bit more of a chew, and that really works in some stuff, including bread. I have been diligently developing bread recipes with it, and the bread that I use it in tends to have more of a pull. It doesn't just break open like that, kind of, you have to tear at it, which is not something that we often get with gluten-free bread. I didn't mention, but as with all the flours, make sure the ones that you're buying are gluten-free. A lot of them can be processed in the same places as wheat and therefore not celiac safe, so just make sure you are checking out where you're getting this one from. And yeah, sometimes called glutinous rice flour because not because there's gluten in it, but glutinous means sticky. Comes from the Latin word gluten or glutino, I don't know. It comes from a Latin word that means sticky or like glue. Next one I wanted to mention is just normal rice flour. As I'm pouring it in, you might be able to notice that there is a different coarseness to this. Rice flour is a little bit more coarse than sweet rice flour, also a little bit more coarse than tapioca and general gluten-free flour blends. I don't use rice flour by itself very often. I find if you do use just rice flour by itself, you can feel it, the bakes feel sandy, a little bit coarse. It's not as pleasant. If you are just using rice flour in a bake, sometimes it's best to let it sit and let them absorb. However, another really good one to use in combination with flours. So this rice flour and the tapioca flour and a normal gluten-free blend is how I make my dumpling wrappers. And I also, because it does have a little bit more structure, sometimes use it when I'm making tempura vegetables. And there actually are places in Japan that I've been to that just use rice flour for tempura batter, and I think it works really well. Our next one is Psyllium Husk. You know what? I don't think I've ever heard someone say this out loud, so I really hope it's pronounced psyllium. So this is another binder. It acts kind of similar to Xanthan Gum, actually pretty similar. As you can see, I'm mixing it with water. It gets pretty gluggy pretty quickly as well. It forms those pretend gluten structures that we very desperately need in gluten-free food. This is great, and you could technically use Xanthan Gum and Psyllium Husk interchangeably. However, I probably would lean to just using this with bread. I kind of feel like it has a little bit of a different crumb, and the crumb suits bread better. And as with any binder, it helps with handling the dough, because as we know, gluten-free doughs need to have more moisture. It's just how life works, and that can be quite tricky if you're trying to do something with the dough, like plait it or make it a certain shape. So having a binder in there is pretty essential, if you ask me. Our next one is flaxseed, ground flaxseed, and I don't really have the most grounded flaxseed available. I think the finer the better, but you know, do what you can with what you got, and this is what we've got today. So flaxseed is a fantastic replacer for egg. It also kind of works as a binder as well. I'm going to show you sort of an example. This flaxseed, you can see it's quite coarse. Probably could be easier to use if it was a little bit finer, but oh well. I'm going to add a little bit of water in with this flaxseed, and we're just going to let it sit. And letting it sit is quite important because it does absorb more moisture over an extended period of time. It doesn't happen immediately. So now you're seeing the one that I've left for about 3 or 4 minutes. You can see it's kind of gone gluggy, a little bit like an egg white, and that's kind of the texture that we're looking for, if I'm being honest. I'd probably leave it to sit 5 or 10 minutes longer just for maximum absorption. You generally, I think the rule is you only need 1 tablespoon of flaxseed for 3 tablespoons of water, and that sort of is 1 egg. It replaces about 1 egg, but just a really helpful thing to use. I know this isn't specifically for gluten-free baking, more for vegan baking, which I do dabble in just a little bit, but still something that I find really useful and good fiber. My next must-have for gluten-free baking is a gluten-free baking flour mix. Seems a bit obvious, but I thought I'd mention there is so many types of gluten-free flours out there, and you can absolutely do the work and figure out how to make a blend that best suits you. But if you don't have the time, most of us don't, just grab yourself a gluten-free flour blend mix. This is the Dove's Free From one. It's the one that I use most over here in the UK. If I was in New Zealand, I'd probably use the Edmonds one. They're quite similar. I think there is one ingredient that in here that the Edmonds one doesn't have. But also in terms of looking for gluten-free flours, I tend to stay away from one that does have xanthan gum in it, so I can control the amount of xanthan gum that I put in it. The Dove's gluten-free flour mix contains rice flour, potato flour, tapioca flour, maize flour and buckwheat flour, which is a nice and generic combination that gives you a bit of starches, a bit of proteins, and generally tends to work for a lot of things. However, just because I've got a whole flour mix doesn't mean that I only use the flour mix for every bake. So as I said at the start, sometimes I substitute this flour for a bit of almond flour to give it a little bit more moisture. Sometimes with this I add in a little bit of tapioca flour to give it a little bit more stretch, a little bit more gumminess. Always good to have some on hand if you feel like baking, and it really does work with most things. The last thing that I think is essential to have in your gluten-free baking cupboard is just some bread mixes. This one is a beautiful sourdough starter from the Gluten Free Bakery. Why? Because gluten-free breads can be quite difficult to make, and sometimes we just don't have the time to be able to do all of those learning, and fresh bread is also the most wonderful thing. I've also found that if you are just starting out with gluten-free baking and you do eventually want to learn how to bake gluten-free breads, starting out with like a ready mix is a good way to learn how much moisture you need, what the different processes are, especially if you've baked gluten bread before, how different it can be, and you're not just diving straight into the deep end, into the world of gluten-free bread. Once you understand the process and you've got a good recipe, gluten-free bread can be super easy to make. But if you're just worried about taking that first step, just grab some friggin' bread mixes to help you out. This one, all you need to put in this one is warm water. Anyway, that is my top baking ingredients for gluten-free baking. If I was just to say my top ingredient across the board, it would be chocolate. I am looking to do a sort of breakdown on gluten-free flours as well, so go through plenty more flours than we already talked about today. I just talked about the ones that I use most often. What are you doing? Oh yes. It's come to remind me the most important thing for gluten-free baking is to have a friend to share the treats with. Yeah, so a deep dive into sort of gluten-free flours, how they respond to water, what their sort of properties are. I think it would be very interesting and maybe useful to some people. Let me know if that's something you'd like to see. But otherwise, I'm going to finish up here. Have a wonderful day wherever you're at, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!